Humble woman found the Millionaire's unlimited credit card and immediately went to return the card. But what she asked for in return left the millionaire in tears right away. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. Sarah Bennett huddled closer to Marcus as they walked through the rain-slicked streets of London, sharing the meager protection of his weathered umbrella. At 25, she had imagined her life would be different, perhaps working as an art teacher, living in a cozy flat, planning for the future. Instead, she and Marcus were struggling to make ends meet, sharing a tiny bedsit in one of London's less desirable neighbourhoods. The evening air was crisp with early autumn chill as they made their way home from their respective jobs, she from her position as a coffee shop barista, he from his work as a bicycle courier. Their shoes splashed through puddles, reflecting the golden glow of street lamps, creating ripples that distorted the city lights into dancing patterns. "We'll figure something out about the rent," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying that gentle optimism that had first drawn Sarah to him 2 years ago. "Mr. Patterson said he'd give us until the end of the month." Sarah nodded, but her throat felt tight. Their landlord's patience was wearing thin, and their combined income barely covered the basics. Marcus's student loans from his unfinished degree in social work weighed heavily on them both, and Sarah's dreams of art school seemed more distant with each passing month. They were passing through Mayfair, a shortcut they sometimes took on their way home, though the contrast between the luxury boutiques and their own circumstances always made Sarah feel like an intruder. As they hurried past the gleaming windows of high-end shops, something caught her eye, a rectangular piece of plastic on the wet pavement, partially hidden beneath a fallen leaf. Sarah stopped, bending to pick it up. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was holding. A black American Express Centurion card, its surface catching the light from nearby shop windows. The name embossed on its surface read, Alexander Blackwood III. "Marcus, look at this," she whispered, showing him the card. His eyes grew large as he recognized what it was, the legendary black card, reserved for the wealthiest of the wealthy. "That's got to be worth—" Marcus trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. With a card like this, they could pay off their debts, secure a better flat, maybe even put some money aside for education. The temptation was overwhelming, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. But then she thought of her mother, who had raised her alone and always emphasized the importance of integrity, even when times were tough. "Your character is all you truly own," she used to say. Sarah had lost her mother to illness 5 years ago, but those words still echoed in her mind. "We need to return it," Sarah said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "It's the right thing to do." Marcus squeezed her hand, and she saw in his eyes the same mixture of resignation and pride that she felt. "Of course we do," he agreed. "But how do we find this Alexander Blackwood?" Sarah pulled out her phone, one of their few luxuries kept primarily for work purposes, and searched the name. Results appeared immediately. Alexander Blackwood III was a prominent British industrialist, known for his technology investments and luxury hotel chain. "Look," Sarah pointed to an article. "He owns the Blackwood Hotel in Knightsbridge. We could return it there tomorrow morning." They continued their walk home, the card feeling impossibly heavy in Sarah's pocket. That night, in their small bedsit with its peeling wallpaper and temperamental heating, they ate simple sandwiches for dinner and tried not to think about what that card could have meant for their future. As Sarah lay in bed that night, listening to the distant sounds of the city and Marcus's steady breathing beside her, she thought about the choice they'd made. Tomorrow they would return the card, and their lives would continue as before, struggling but honest. She couldn't know then how that simple decision would set in motion events that would change not only their lives, but the lives of countless others. Outside, the rain continued to fall on London's streets, washing away the day's traces, while inside Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, the black card safely tucked away in her jacket pocket, waiting for morning and the journey that lay ahead. The Blackwood Hotel stood like a gleaming fortress of glass and stone in the heart of Knightsbridge, its revolving doors continuously spinning with well-heeled guests and impeccably dressed staff. Sarah and Marcus approached slowly, feeling conspicuous in their worn clothes and scuffed shoes. Sarah gripped Marcus's hand tightly as they pushed through the revolving door into the marble-floored lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across the space, and the air was perfumed with fresh flowers arranged in massive vases. A grand staircase curved upward, its brass railings gleaming like gold. At the front desk, a perfectly groomed receptionist regarded them with barely concealed suspicion. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted she could. "Yes," Sarah said, straightening her shoulders. "We found something that belongs to Mr. Blackwood, and we'd like to return it." Before the receptionist could respond, a sharp voice cut through the lobby's hushed atmosphere. "What's going on here?" A young man in an expertly tailored suit approached, his features bearing a striking resemblance to the photos Sarah had seen of Alexander Blackwood III, though younger and harder somehow. This must be Alexander Blackwood IV, the son and heir to the Blackwood Empire. "We found your father's credit card," Sarah explained, reaching into her pocket to retrieve it. "We wanted to return it to him." The younger Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Did you now?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you haven't used it at all? Shall we check the transaction history?" Sarah felt her face flush. "Of course we haven't used it. We found it last night and came straight here this morning. James," Alexander IV called to a nearby security guard, "please escort these individuals out after we've taken their information. We'll need to investigate any potential fraudulent charges." Marcus stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor hardening. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're trying to do the right thing here." "The right thing?" Alexander IV laughed coldly. "People like you don't just find valuable things and return them out of the goodness of their hearts. What's your angle, hoping for a reward? Or perhaps you've already made copies of the card information?" The lobby had grown quiet, other guests and staff watching the scene unfold. Sarah felt tears of humiliation burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Alexander!" A commanding voice echoed across the lobby. The crowd parted as Alexander Blackwood III himself approached, his silver hair and distinguished features matching the photos Sarah had seen, though he carried himself with an air of authority that no image could capture. "Father," the younger Blackwood acknowledged, straightening his posture, "I was just dealing with these individuals who claim to have found your card." The elder Blackwood studied Sarah and Marcus carefully, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "My card?" he asked, reaching into his suit jacket. His expression changed as he found his wallet empty of the card he was searching for. "Ah, yes, I must have lost it yesterday during my walk." He turned to Sarah. "You found it and brought it back?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, holding out the black card. "Last night in Mayfair. We wanted to return it right away." Alexander III took the card, examined it briefly, then looked back at Sarah and Marcus with an intensity that made them both stand straighter. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes were measuring them in a way that suggested he was seeing far more than their shabby clothes and nervous postures. He turned to his son, and his expression hardened slightly. "Alexander, these people have done something honorable, at considerable inconvenience to themselves, and you respond with accusations and threats?" The younger Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Father, you can't be naive enough to—" "Enough!" Alexander III cut him off. He turned back to Sarah and Marcus. "Please join me for tea in my office. I'd like to hear more about your story." "Father!" Alexander IV protested, but was silenced by a sharp look from his father. As they followed Alexander III toward the elevator, Sarah caught a glimpse of the younger Blackwood's face, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something else. Perhaps fear. She couldn't know then that this moment would mark the beginning of a transformation, not just for Alexander IV, but for all of them. The elevator doors closed silently behind them, and Sarah felt the subtle shift as they began to rise. Whatever happened next, she knew their lives were about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Alexander Blackwood III's office occupied the entire top floor of the hotel, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of London's skyline. As Sarah and Marcus settled into plush leather chairs, a butler appeared silently with a tea service on a silver tray. "Sugar?" the elder Blackwood asked, acting as if serving tea to people in threadbare clothes was an everyday occurrence. After they'd been served, he leaned back in his chair, studying them with keen interest. "Tell me about yourselves." Over the next hour, Sarah and Marcus shared their story, their struggles, their dreams, their determination to build a better life, despite the obstacles. Alexander III listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp mind and, surprisingly, a genuine understanding of their challenges. The conversation was interrupted when Alexander IV burst into the office, having apparently spent the last hour stewing in his anger. "Father, surely you're not serious about entertaining these—" "Sit down, Alexander," his father commanded, his tone brooking no argument. The younger man complied, though his posture radiated defiance. Alexander III set down his teacup with deliberate care. "I've been watching you, son. Your behavior today was merely the latest example of how disconnected you've become from the real world. You've forgotten that our wealth comes with responsibility." "I understand responsibility," Alexander IV protested. "I'm learning to manage the business, aren't I?" "Business is only part of it," his father replied. "True leadership requires empathy, understanding, and wisdom. These are qualities you seem to be lacking lately." The elder Blackwood stood walking to the window. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the expensive carpet. "I've made a decision," he announced. "You will spend the next 24 hours living on the streets." The room fell silent. Alexander IV's face paled. "What? No money, no phone, no cards, just the clothes on your back. Perhaps then you'll understand why honesty like Sarah and Marcus's should be celebrated, not scorned." "This is absurd." The younger Blackwood jumped to his feet. "I have meetings tomorrow, responsibilities, all of which I will handle," his father cut in smoothly. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer I reconsider your position in the company altogether." Sarah and Marcus exchanged uncomfortable glances, feeling like intruders in this family drama. But Alexander III wasn't finished with them yet. "I have a proposal for you both as well," he said, turning to them. "Marcus, you studied social work before financial difficulties forced you to leave university, correct? And Sarah, you're an aspiring artist." They nodded, surprised he'd remembered these details from their conversation. "I'd like you to help Alexander during his 24 hours on the street. Show him what life is really like for people struggling to survive. Help him understand. In return, I'll ensure you both can return to your studies." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. A chance to return to art school? It seemed too good to be true. But then she looked at Alexander IV's hostile expression and wondered if they were signing up for an impossible task. Marcus squeezed her hand under the table. "We accept," he said firmly. "Excellent." Alexander III pressed a button on his desk, and his assistant appeared instantly. "James will help you settle the details. Alexander, you have 1 hour to prepare yourself, no more." As they left the office, Sarah glanced back to see father and son engaged in an intense, silent standoff. Alexander IV's face was a storm of emotions, anger, fear, and wounded pride battling for dominance. In the elevator, Marcus turned to Sarah. "Are we crazy for agreeing to this?" Sarah watched the floor numbers tick down. "Maybe," she admitted. "But everyone deserves a chance to change, don't they?" They couldn't know then that the next 24 hours would test not only Alexander IV's capacity for change, but their own ability to forgive and see beyond their preconceptions. As they stepped out into the lobby, the afternoon sun was already beginning to fade, casting long shadows that seemed to herald the challenging night ahead. An hour later, Alexander IV stood on the pavement outside the Blackwood Hotel, looking decidedly less polished than before. His father's assistant had insisted he change into more appropriate clothing, jeans, a plain sweater, and worn trainers. Without his expensive watch, phone, and wallet, he seemed somehow diminished, though his posture still radiated defiance. "Shall we begin the poverty tour?" he asked sarcastically, shooting a resentful glance at Sarah and Marcus. "This isn't a tour," Marcus replied calmly. "This is your life for the next 24 hours. First lesson, it's nearly dinner time and you have no money. What do you suggest we do?" Alexander's confident expression faltered slightly. "Surely you're not suggesting we e-beg?" "There are soup kitchens," Sarah offered, choosing to ignore his tone. "But most are closed by now. We could try St. Martin's. They sometimes have evening services." They began walking, Alexander trailing behind them like a reluctant shadow. The streets of London had changed character as evening approached. The well-heeled shoppers had been replaced by tired office workers hurrying home, barely sparing a glance for the three young people making their way through the gathering dusk. At St. Martin's, they found the soup kitchen closed. Alexander's stomach growled audibly, and Sarah noticed him eyeing a nearby cafe with longing. "Welcome to the first challenge," Marcus said. "Hunger, something you've probably never really experienced before." "This is ridiculous," Alexander muttered. These are artificial circumstances. In real life, I would never... But this is real life for many people, Sarah interrupted. Including us, sometimes. The choices you're facing tonight? We face them every day. They walked on, heading toward a part of London tourists rarely saw. The buildings grew shabbier, the streets less well lit. Alexander's steps became more hesitant, his eyes darting nervously at shadows. Near a railway bridge, they encountered an elderly woman named Rose, whom Sarah and Marcus knew from their neighborhood. She sat on a piece of cardboard, surrounded by her worldly possessions in plastic bags. "Evening, loves," Rose called out cheerfully. "Who's your new friend?" "This is Alex," Sarah said, deliberately using the shortened form. "He's experiencing some hard times." Rose's weathered face creased with sympathy. "Aren't we all, dear? Here, I've got half a sandwich left from what that nice church lady brought earlier. You look like you could use it." Alexander stared at the offered sandwich, wrapped in paper napkins. His expression cycled through disbelief, disgust, and finally, as his hunger won out, reluctant gratitude. Thank you," he managed, accepting the sandwich. After a moment's hesitation, he split it into thirds, offering pieces to Sarah and Marcus. They declined, knowing Rose would have insisted they take it if they needed it. As Alexander ate, Rose chatted about her life, how she'd once been a schoolteacher, how a series of misfortunes had left her homeless, how she still tried to help others despite her circumstances. Sarah watched Alexander's face as he listened, seeing the first tiny cracks appearing in his armor of privilege. The evening grew colder, and Rose wrapped herself in her blankets. "You'll want to find somewhere to sleep soon," she advised. "The nights get right cold, they do." As they said goodbye to Rose, Alexander was unusually quiet. The reality of spending a night on the streets seemed to be sinking in. "Where?" He cleared his throat. "Where do people usually sleep?" "Let's head toward the church," Marcus suggested. "There's a sheltered doorway there that's usually empty. Unless you'd prefer the park." Alexander's eyes widened at the mention of sleeping in a park. "The church," he said quickly. As they walked, Sarah noticed his steps were less certain, his shoulders less square. The carefully constructed world he'd lived in was beginning to crumble, one small revelation at a time. But the night was still young, and there were harder lessons ahead. They passed a group of young professionals spilling out of a pub, laughing and checking their phones, the kind of people Alexander would normally count as friends. Now they walked past without a glance, as if he were invisible. Sarah saw him flinch at their indifference, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that this experience might actually change him. The church doorway provided little comfort against the cold night air. Alexander sat huddled between Sarah and Marcus, his knees drawn up to his chest, his earlier arrogance replaced by exhaustion and growing uncertainty. "How do you bear it?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not knowing where you'll sleep or when you'll eat next?" "You find strength you didn't know you had," Marcus replied, "and sometimes you find kindness in unexpected places." As if to illustrate his point, a figure approached through the darkness, Father Michael, the parish priest whom Sarah and Marcus knew well. He carried 3 paper cups of hot tea and a bag of pastries. "I thought you might need these," he said kindly, handing out the provisions. "It's going to be a cold night." Alexander accepted the tea with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. "Thank you," he said, and for the first time since they'd met him, his voice carried genuine gratitude. Father Michael settled beside them, his presence somehow making the cold stone steps feel less harsh. "Each person's story is unique," he said gently, "but pain and struggle are universal experiences. They can either break us or transform us." As they sipped their tea, Father Michael shared stories of the people he'd helped over the years, the banker who lost everything in the financial crisis, the talented musician who couldn't afford her medication, the young family sleeping in their car after a redundancy. "What amazes me," he continued, "is how often those who have the least give the most. Like Rose sharing her sandwich earlier, despite having so little herself." Alexander stared into his tea, his expression troubled. I always assumed people ended up here because of poor choices or laziness." "Life is more complicated than that," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is one stroke of bad luck, one illness, one job loss. My mother was a talented artist, but when she became ill, she trailed off, and Marcus squeezed her hand supportively. Alexander looked at her with new interest, perhaps hearing the pain beneath her words for the first time. "What happened to her?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, not ready to share that part of her story. "The point is, she taught me that our circumstances don't define our worth. It's our actions, our choices, the way we treat others. That's what matters." Father Michael nodded approvingly. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Sarah replied, her voice catching slightly. "Sometimes I see her in my dreams, painting in our old flat. She always said art was her way of making sense of the world." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "I've never had to make sense of the world," he admitted. "Everything was always just arranged for me, perfect and predictable." "And now?" Marcus asked. "Now?" Alexander looked around at the dark street, the occasional passerby hurrying past without a glance, the distant sounds of the city that seemed somehow more threatening than before. "Now I'm not sure of anything anymore." Father Michael stood, brushing off his clothes. "Uncertainty can be a gift," he said. "It opens our eyes to truths we might otherwise miss." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. "The church's basement has some cots for emergencies. Perhaps tonight qualifies." As they followed him into the church's warm interior, Sarah noticed Alexander pausing to look at a painting on the wall, a simple but powerful depiction of a family seeking shelter. His expression was thoughtful, almost vulnerable. In the basement, Father Michael showed them to 3 cots and provided blankets that smelled of laundry soap and kindness. As he turned to leave, Alexander spoke up. "Father, thank you. Not just for this, but for helping me understand some things." The priest smiled. "Understanding is just the beginning. The real question is what you'll do with it." As they settled onto their cots, Sarah found herself studying Alexander's profile in the dim light. The proud, disdainful young man from the hotel lobby seemed to have been replaced by someone else, someone younger, less certain, but perhaps more real. She thought about her mother's paintings, how they always seemed to reveal the hidden beauty in broken things. Maybe people were like that too. Sometimes it just took the right circumstances to reveal what lay beneath the surface. Dawn crept into the church basement through small ground-level windows, painting strips of golden light across the concrete floor. Alexander sat on his cot, watching the sunrise with red-rimmed eyes. He hadn't slept much, Sarah could tell, but something about him had shifted during the night. "I keep thinking about Rose," he said suddenly, "and all the others we met last night. They're not so different from me, are they? Just less lucky." Marcus nodded encouragingly. "That's what we've been trying to tell you." They made their way upstairs, where Father Michael had left coffee and breakfast pastries in the church kitchen. As they ate, Alexander seemed lost in thought, occasionally making notes on a paper napkin with a borrowed pen. "What are you writing?" Sarah asked. "Ideas," he replied, then hesitated before continuing. "About how the hotel could help. We have so much space, so many resources, and in winter when it's cold—" His voice trailed off as footsteps echoed through the church. A moment later, Alexander Blackwood III appeared in the kitchen doorway, immaculately dressed despite the early hour. "Good morning," he said, surveying the scene. "I trust you've had an educational night." Before Alexander IV could respond, a man in a sharp suit appeared behind his father, speaking in urgent whispers. The elder Blackwood's expression changed subtly as he listened, his eyes fixing on Sarah with new intensity. "Miss Bennet," he said carefully, "would you mind joining me for a private conversation?" Sarah glanced uncertainly at Marcus, who looked equally confused. "Of course," she agreed, following Alexander III into a small church office. The man in the suit was waiting inside with a folder. Alexander III gestured for Sarah to sit, then studied her face for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me about your mother," he said finally. Sarah blinked in surprise. "My mother?" "Yes. You mentioned she was an artist. What was her name?" "Eleanor," Sarah replied, a familiar ache in her chest. "Eleanor Bennet, but she used her maiden name, Eleanor Chase, for her artwork." Alexander III's breath caught slightly. He opened the folder and removed a photograph, placing it carefully on the desk between them. Sarah leaned forward and felt her world tilt sideways. The photo showed a much younger Eleanor, smiling brilliantly beside a man Sarah had never seen before. They were standing in front of an art gallery, her mother's paintings visible through the window behind them. "This is Richard Blackwood," Alexander III said softly. "My younger brother. He disappeared from our lives 26 years ago, after a falling out with our father. We recently learned he had been living under the name Richard Chase." Sarah's hands began to tremble. "What are you saying?" "We've been searching for any trace of Richard since our father's passing last year. When you mentioned your mother was an artist, something clicked. The investigator's report just confirmed it." He paused, his voice gentling. "Richard was your father, Sarah. You're a Blackwood." The room seemed to spin. Sarah thought of her mother's mysterious sadness, her reluctance to speak about Sarah's father, the odd comments about Sarah having his eyes. "But why didn't she ever tell me?" "Richard was afraid our father would try to control your life the way he controlled ours. He chose to stay away to protect you both." Alexander III's expression softened. He never knew Eleanor was expecting when he left. By the time he found out, she had already... Sarah stood abruptly, needing space, air, time to process this revelation. But as she reached the door, Alexander III spoke again. "Sarah? You should know, everything Richard left behind, including his share of the family business, was placed in trust. As his only heir, it's all legally yours." She turned back, her head spinning with implications. I can't. "Take time to process this," he said kindly, "but know that you have a place in this family if you want it." Through the office window, Sarah could see Marcus and Alexander IV deep in conversation, probably discussing plans for helping the homeless. The world she'd known yesterday was transforming into something entirely new, full of possibilities she'd never imagined. But as she watched Marcus gesture enthusiastically about something, she realized that wealth and status weren't what mattered most. It was the choices they made, the lives they touched, the good they could do with whatever resources they had. The real question was, how would she use this unexpected twist of fate to make a difference? Sarah stood at the window of her new office in the Blackwood Hotel, still struggling to reconcile her past life with her present reality. 2 weeks had passed since the revelation of her true identity, and each day brought new adjustments, new discoveries, and new challenges. The office had been Alexander IV's idea. "If we're going to change lives, we need a proper headquarters," he'd insisted, his former arrogance transformed into passionate determination. The space overlooked the hotel's entrance, allowing Sarah to observe the constant flow of people below. Tourists dragging expensive luggage, business executives in tailored suits, and now, increasingly, people seeking help from their fledgling outreach program. Marcus knocked on the open door carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing one on her desk. The architect just sent over the preliminary plans for the shelter renovation. Their relationship had weathered the dramatic changes surprisingly well. If anything, Marcus seemed more comfortable now that they were equals in their new endeavor, both contributing their unique perspectives and skills. "Have you seen the latest proposals from Alex?" Sarah asked, gesturing to a stack of papers on her desk. The younger Blackwood had thrown himself into the project with unexpected fervor, his business acumen finding new purpose in social enterprise. "I have," Marcus smiled. "He's come a long way from that first day in the lobby, hasn't he?" Before Sarah could respond, Alexander IV himself burst into the office, his eyes bright with excitement. "You won't believe who I just spoke with," he announced. "Remember that tech billionaire father's been trying to partner with? He's interested in our project. Not just interested. He wants to implement similar programs at his company's properties worldwide." Sarah and Marcus exchanged knowing looks. Alexander's enthusiasm was infectious, but they'd learned to temper grand plans with practical considerations. "That's fantastic," Sarah said carefully, "but let's make sure we get things right here first. Have you spoken with Rose about the peer support program she suggested?" Alexander's face softened at the mention of Rose. The elderly former teacher had become something of a mentor to him, her straight-talking wisdom helping to ground his ambitious ideas in reality. "Actually, yes. She's already recruited 3 other people with lived experience who want to help. And Father Michael's agreed to let us use the church hall for training sessions." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Alexander III stood in the doorway, looking both proud and slightly amused at finding the 3 of them huddled together over coffee and papers. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, entering the office. "I wanted to show Sarah something." He placed an old leather portfolio on her desk. "We found this in storage at the family estate." "It belonged to your father?" Sarah opened the portfolio with trembling hands. Inside were sketches, notes, and photographs, glimpses of the father she'd never known. One sketch caught her eye, a detailed plan for a community art center, with notes about making art accessible to underprivileged youth. "He had dreams similar to yours," Alexander III said softly. "He just never got the chance to realize them." Sarah traced her fingers over her father's handwriting, feeling a connection across time. "Maybe we can make them happen now," she said, looking up at her uncle with determination. Alexander IV moved closer to examine the sketches. "We could incorporate an art program into the shelter," he suggested. "Give people a way to express themselves, maybe even sell their work. And provide job training in creative fields," Marcus added, his social work background emerging. "Graphic design, photography, crafts." As they brainstormed, Sarah noticed Alexander III watching them with satisfaction. Her uncle had orchestrated the initial meeting that brought them together, but even he couldn't have predicted how their different perspectives and experiences would combine to create something truly transformative. A commotion from the lobby drew their attention. Rose had arrived for her regular meeting, but this time she'd brought someone with her, a young woman clutching a portfolio of her own artwork, hope and uncertainty warring on her face. "Shall we?" Sarah asked, standing up. Her father's portfolio sat on her desk, a bridge between past and present, while before her stretched a future full of possibility. As they headed downstairs to meet their newest arrival, Sarah felt a deep sense of rightness. They were building something meaningful here, something that transcended class boundaries and social expectations, something that would have made both her parents proud. The autumn rain beat steadily against the windows of the Blackwood Hotel's newly renovated East Wing, where the shelter and community center were taking shape. Workers moved purposefully through the space, installing security systems and setting up dormitory areas, while Sarah supervised the hanging of artwork created by their first group of program participants. "The fire marshal says we can open next week," Alexander IV announced, joining her by a particularly striking painting of the London skyline at dawn. "Though Father Michael thinks we should start with a smaller number of residents than planned, just to work out any issues." Sarah nodded, appreciating how her cousin had learned to balance his ambitious vision with practical considerations. The past month had been a crash course in the complexities of turning idealistic plans into workable solutions. "Marcus mentioned we might have a problem with the job training program," she said, turning to face him. "Some of the high-end shops we partnered with are getting nervous about having our participants work there." Alexander's jaw tightened, a reminder that while he'd changed dramatically, the businessman in him still bristled at obstacles. "Leave that to me," he said. "They seem to forget whose family owns their building leases." "Alex," Sarah warned, "we can't force people to participate. We need willing partners who believe in what we're doing." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he'd picked up during their night on the streets. "You're right, of course, it's just frustrating. These people deserve a chance. Which is why we'll find other partners," she assured him. "Rose already has 3 local cafes interested in her barista training program." Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's arrival, his expression troubled. "We need to talk," he said, leading them to a quiet corner. "Someone's been talking to the press. There's going to be a story about Sarah's background in tomorrow's papers." Sarah felt her stomach clench. While her identity as Richard Blackwood's daughter wasn't a secret, they'd managed to keep it out of the media, allowing their project to develop based on its own merits rather than family drama. "How bad is it?" Alexander asked. "They're spinning it as a rags-to-riches story," Marcus replied, "but they're also digging into Eleanor's past, suggesting she deliberately kept Sarah from her inheritance. Some of the comments are unkind." Sarah leaned against the wall, feeling the smooth new paint under her fingers. "Mum did what she thought was best," she said firmly. "She wanted me to grow up normal, to understand the value of work and integrity. I won't let them tarnish her memory." Alexander was already on his phone typing furiously. "I'll have our PR team prepare a statement. We can get ahead of this, control the narrative." "No," Sarah said, straightening up. "No prepared statements. If they want a story, let's give them one worth telling. Show them what we're actually doing here." She walked to the center of the room, where a group of program participants was attending a financial literacy workshop, Among them was the young artist Rose had brought in weeks ago, now training as an art therapist for future shelter residents. "This is the real story," Sarah continued. "Not who my father was or wasn't. Not some fairy tale about sudden wealth. The story is about people helping people, about second chances and new beginnings." Marcus smiled, recognizing the determination in her voice. "What do you have in mind?" "We move up the opening. Invite the press to see everything. The shelter, the training programs, the art center. Let them meet our participants, hear their stories. Show them what happens when people from different backgrounds work together towards something meaningful." Alexander's eyes lit up with understanding. "Turn their gossip piece into a story about social change. Brilliant." "Rose always says the best way to fight darkness is to shine a light," Sarah said, watching the workshop participants engaged in their lesson. "So let's shine a light on what matters." As they began planning the press event, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the new windows. She saw her mother's determination there, and something else, perhaps a glimpse of her father's vision for change. The upcoming media attention might not be what they'd planned, but maybe, like everything else in this journey, it was an opportunity in disguise. Outside, the rain began to ease, and a patch of late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the space where so many lives would soon begin to transform. Sarah smiled, remembering something her mother used to say. "Art isn't about making perfect pictures, it's about making meaning from the materials life gives you." They were all artists here, in their own way, creating something new from the unexpected materials life had provided, and tomorrow they would share their creation with the world. The morning of the press event dawned clear and bright, a welcome change from the autumn rain. The Blackwood Hotel's East Wing buzzed with activity, as residents, staff and volunteers prepared to share their story with the world. Sarah stood in the art gallery they'd created, surrounded by works that told stories of struggle, hope, and transformation. Each piece had been created by someone whose life had been touched by the project, former rough sleepers, struggling artists, people rebuilding their lives one brush stroke at a time. "The first reporters are arriving," Marcus said, appearing at her side. "Rose is already charming them with her stories." Sarah smiled, picturing the elderly woman who had become the heart and soul of their community. Rose's journey from teacher to rough sleeper to program coordinator was exactly the kind of story they wanted to tell today. "Miss Blackwood?" A young woman in a neat suit approached, notebook in hand. "I'm Emma Chen from The Guardian. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Before Sarah could respond, Alexander Thor appeared. "Actually," he said, "I think you should talk to some of our residents first. Sarah's story isn't the most important one here today." The reporter looked surprised, but followed Alexander as he led her toward a group of program participants. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her cousin's growth. The arrogant young man who had once dismissed people like her was now their strongest advocate. Throughout the morning, journalists moved through the space, recording stories that defied their expectations. They met James, a former accountant who had lost everything in a market crash and was now helping others learn financial literacy. They spoke with Maria, whose artwork now hung in the hotel lobby, inspiring guests to support their initiative. The tech billionaire Alexander had mentioned arrived with his entourage, but instead of heading straight to the executive offices, he spent hours talking with residents and volunteers, scribbling notes and nodding enthusiastically. "This is more than charity," he declared later to a group of reporters. "This is a new model for social change. The Blackwoods have created something revolutionary here." In a quiet moment between interviews, Sarah found herself in her father's former office, now a counseling room, looking at his portrait on the wall. Alexander III joined her, his presence supportive but unobtrusive. "He would be proud," he said softly, "not just of what you've built, but of who you've become." "I wish I could have known him," Sarah replied, "but in a way I feel like I do. His dreams are living on through this project." Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the main hall. A government minister had arrived unannounced, drawn by the media coverage. She moved through the space with evident interest, asking detailed questions about their programs and methods. "We need to replicate this," the minister announced to her aides, "not just in London, across the country. This could transform how we approach homelessness and social mobility." As Sarah watched the minister engage with their residents, she felt a subtle shift in the energy of the room. They weren't just showing off a successful charity project, they were demonstrating a new possibility, a way of bridging divides that had seemed unbridgeable. Marcus found her later in the rooftop garden, where residents grew vegetables and herbs for the hotel's kitchens. "You should see the social media response," he said excitedly. "People are calling it a revolution in social responsibility. Hotels and businesses across the country want to know how they can implement similar programs." Sarah looked out over the London skyline, thinking of all the lives touched by a simple decision to return a lost credit card. Mom always said that integrity was about more than doing the right thing. It was about creating ripples of goodness in the world. She was right, Marcus agreed, taking her hand. "And your ripples are becoming waves." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Sarah thought about the transformation they'd all undergone. Alexander the Fourth had found his purpose. Marcus was using his social work training to change lives. She had discovered a family she never knew and a calling she never expected. But more importantly, they had shown that walls between social classes could become bridges, that privilege could be transformed into purpose, and that small acts of kindness could spark movements of change. The press event had succeeded beyond their expectations, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The real story was still unfolding, one life at a time, in the quiet moments of connection and transformation that happened every day within these walls. 6 months after the press event, the Blackwood Initiative, as it had come to be known, was thriving. The model had been adopted by hotels and businesses in 3 other cities, with more launching every month. But for Sarah, success wasn't measured in headlines or expansion plans. It was measured in individual stories of transformation. She sat in the community center's cafe, watching as Rose supervised a new batch of barista trainees. The space had become a popular spot for hotel guests and local business people, breaking down barriers as they shared tables with program participants and community members. "How your usual?" asked Thomas, one of their first graduates, now employed as the cafe's assistant manager. His confident smile bore no trace of the desperate young man who had first walked through their doors. "Thanks, Thomas," Sarah replied, marking another small victory in her mental tally. Alexander the Fourth burst in, his energy filling the room as usual, but now tempered with genuine warmth and understanding. "So you won't believe what just happened," he announced, sliding into the chair opposite Sarah. "Remember that investment banker who was so skeptical about hiring our graduates? He just called to increase his commitment, says they're his best employees." "Of course they are," Rose interjected, joining them with her own coffee. "When people are given a real chance, they rise to it. You should know that better than anyone, young man." Alexander grinned, accepting the gentle ribbing. His night on the streets had become something of a legend, retold often as an example of how experience could change perspective. Marcus arrived next, carrying a stack of files and wearing the slightly harried look of someone juggling multiple responsibilities. As their programs expanded, he had taken on the role of operations director, using his social work background to ensure their growth didn't come at the expense of their mission. "The new family wing is ready," he reported. "And the childcare center opens next week. Father Michael has already blessed the space." Sarah felt a familiar warmth in her chest. The project had grown far beyond their initial vision, responding to needs as they discovered them. The family wing had been Rose's idea, born from her observation that many rough sleepers had children they couldn't keep with them in traditional shelters. "Have you told them about the award?" Alexander III asked, appearing suddenly in their midst. He had a habit of showing up at key moments, his quiet pride in their accomplishments a constant source of encouragement. "What award?" Sarah asked, looking between them. "The Queen's Award for Enterprise," her uncle announced, in the Promoting Opportunity category. They're recognizing the Blackwood Initiative as a model of social innovation. The news sparked a flurry of excitement in the cafe, with residents and staff gathering to celebrate. Sarah watched as Alexander IV hugged Rose, as Marcus high-fived Thomas as her uncle beamed with pride. In the midst of the celebration, Sarah slipped away to her office. On her desk sat her mother's old sketchbook and her father's portfolio, bridges between her past and present. She opened the sketchbook to a drawing her mother had made years ago, a simple image of hands clasped in support. "You were right, Mom," she whispered, "about everything. About integrity, about art, about the power of kindness to transform lives." A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. It was Alexander IV, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Can we talk?" he asked. Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting how naturally they had fallen into their roles as cousins and colleagues. "I've been thinking," he said, "about that first day in the lobby. How differently things could have gone if Father hadn't intervened. If you and Marcus hadn't agreed to help me learn. Everything would be different," Sarah agreed. "But you were ready to change. You just needed the opportunity to see things differently." "Like everyone we help here," he nodded. "I understand that now. Really understand it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want to expand the program, not just to other cities, but to really transform how the wealthy see their role in society. Will you help me?" Sarah looked out her window at the bustling community they'd created, at Thomas serving coffee with pride, at Rose mentoring new arrivals, at Marcus organizing activities for the children who would soon fill their new family wing. "Of course," she said. "That's what family does." As the afternoon sun painted London in shades of gold, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. A lost credit card, an act of integrity, a night on the streets. Small moments that had sparked a movement of change. They had started by trying to help people find shelter, but they had built something far more valuable, a community where everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, could find belonging, purpose, and hope. 1 year to the day since Sarah had found that black credit card on a rainy London street, she stood at the podium in the Blackwood Hotel's grand ballroom, facing an audience that represented both ends of the social spectrum: corporate leaders and former rough sleepers, philanthropists and program participants, all gathered to celebrate the first anniversary of the Blackwood Initiative. "When I was a child," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "my mother taught me that art wasn't just about creating beauty, it was about revealing the beauty that already exists in unexpected places. Today, I look around this room and see her wisdom in action." The ballroom had been transformed into a gallery showcasing artwork created by program participants. Each piece told a story of transformation, of lives rebuilt and dreams rekindled. But more striking than the art was the sight of CEOs and former rough sleepers engaged in genuine conversation, sharing ideas and experiences as equals. "A year ago, many people said this couldn't work," she continued, "that the gap between social classes was too wide, that people wouldn't change, that idealism couldn't survive in the real world. They were wrong." Alexander IV sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly. Beside him, Rose beamed with grandmotherly pride. Marcus stood at the back of the room, managing the event with his usual quiet efficiency, but his eyes never left Sarah. "The numbers tell part of our story," Sarah said, gesturing to the presentation screen behind her. 500 people housed, 300 employed. 7 new centers opened across the country. But the real story isn't in the numbers. It's in the connections we've built, the barriers we've broken, the lives we've transformed. She paused, looking at the faces before her. Thomas, now training other baristas and developing a coffee shop franchise model that would create jobs for program graduates. Maria, whose art therapy program had become a model for trauma recovery. James, whose financial literacy workshops had expanded to serve not just rough sleepers, but struggling families throughout London. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation, she continued, has been in those who came from privilege. My cousin Alexander spent one night on the streets and emerged with a new vision of his role in society. Since then, dozens of other business leaders have followed his example, experiencing firsthand the realities of homelessness. Each one has become an advocate for change. In the audience, several well-known faces nodded, remembering their own nights on the streets. The practice had become something of a rite of passage among London's business elite, sparked by Alexander's story. "We're not just helping people find homes and jobs," Sarah explained. "We're building bridges between communities that have been separated for generations. We're proving that empathy, when combined with action, can transform not just individual lives but entire social systems." As she spoke, Sarah caught sight of her uncle at the back of the room. Alexander III stood with quiet dignity, watching the fruition of a vision that had begun with his decision to teach his son a lesson. Beside him was a portrait of Richard Blackwood, Sarah's father, recently uncovered from the family archives. In it, he stood before a community centre he'd hoped to build, his eyes filled with the same determination Sarah now felt. My father dreamed of using the Blackwood resources to create real social change, Sarah said, her voice softening. He never got the chance to realize that dream, but today we're not just realizing it, we're expanding it. We're showing that wealth and privilege can be transformed into tools for social justice, that business success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. The room fell silent as Sarah reached the heart of her message. A year ago, I found a credit card on the street. I could have used it to solve my own problems. Instead, I chose integrity, not knowing that choice would lead to all of this. But that's how change happens. One choice, one connection, one transformation at a time. As applause filled the ballroom, Sarah looked out at the faces before her, faces that represented every level of society, now united in a common cause. They had created something unprecedented, a model of social change that worked because it transformed both those who gave help and those who received it. The evening continued with presentations from program participants, each story adding to the tapestry of transformation they had woven together. But for Sarah, the most powerful moment came later, when she overheard a conversation between a banking executive and a former rough sleeper, earnestly discussing ways to improve access to financial services for vulnerable populations. This, she realized, was her parents' legacy, not just the art that had shaped her vision or the wealth that had provided opportunities, but the belief that every person deserved the chance to contribute to society's transformation. As the anniversary celebration wound down, Sarah found herself in her father's old office, now her own, looking out over the London skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one perhaps representing a life touched by their work over the past year. Marcus joined her, loosening his tie after a long evening of event management. "Quite a night," he said, standing beside her at the window. "Did you see the minister's face when Thomas presented the expansion proposal?" Sarah smiled, remembering the government minister's amazement at the sophisticated business plan presented by their former rough sleeper. "We're rewriting the rules about who can contribute to social change," she said. "That's what makes this work." A knock at the door revealed Alexander IV, still energized despite the late hour. "The international delegates want to meet first thing tomorrow," he announced. "They're keen to implement the program in their own countries." Rose appeared behind him, her eyes twinkling. "Don't forget to tell them about the real secret to our success," she said. "It's not just about providing services, it's about changing hearts." Alexander III was the last to join them, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "I've been waiting for the right moment to share this," he said, placing it on Sarah's desk. "We found it in your father's storage unit." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. Inside, in her father's handwriting, were detailed plans for a global initiative combining business acumen with social responsibility. The final entry, dated shortly before his disappearance, read, "Perhaps someone else will fulfill this dream someday." "He knew," Sarah said softly. Somehow he knew the dream wouldn't die with him. Looking around the office at these people who had become her family, both by blood and by choice, Sarah felt the weight of the past year's achievements, but also the excitement of future possibilities. Marcus, her partner in both life and work, whose social work background had kept them focused on real human needs. Alexander IV, her cousin, whose transformation from privileged heir to passionate advocate had inspired others to change. Rose, their wisdom keeper, whose lived experience guided their programs. And Alexander III, her uncle, whose decision to teach his son empathy had set everything in motion. "We've come so far," Alexander IV mused, "but sometimes I feel we're just beginning." "We are," Sarah agreed. "Every person who changes their perspective, every bridge we build between communities, every life we help transform, it's all part of a bigger change. We're not just helping people find homes and jobs, we're creating a new model of society." Through the window, the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. A new day, bringing new opportunities for transformation. Below, the first participants of their morning program were arriving, ready to begin their own journeys of change. "Your mother would be proud," Rose said gently. "Both your parents would be. You've taken the best of both of them, your mother's artistic vision and your father's social conscience, and created something entirely new." Sarah touched the journal on her desk, feeling the connection to her past, even as she looked toward the future. "We all have the power to create change," she said. "Sometimes we just need someone to believe in us first." As her office filled with the morning light, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. A lost credit card, an act of integrity, a night on the streets. Small moments that had sparked a movement. But the real transformation had been in the connections they'd built, the barriers they'd broken, the lives they'd touched. They had started by trying to help people find shelter, but they had built something far more valuable. A model for social change that recognized the dignity and potential in every person, that transformed both those who gave help and those who received it. As the others began discussing plans for the day ahead, Sarah opened her father's journal to a blank page and began to write. The dream didn't die. It grew. And it's still growing. One life, one choice, one transformation at a time. Outside her window, London was awakening to a new day, full of possibilities for change. The Blackwood Initiative had shown that walls could become bridges, that privilege could become purpose, that small acts of integrity could spark movements of transformation. And this was just the beginning.